The cold wind whispered through the empty streets as Maria clutched her son tighter to her chest. The dim glow of a flickering street lamp barely illuminated the worn-out sidewalk where she sat, her back resting against the rough brick wall of an old building. Her coat, tattered and thin, did little to keep out the biting chill, and her son, Matteo, shivered in her arms. His small body felt lighter than it should, weaker than it used to be. She could hear the faint wheeze in his breathing, a painful reminder of the sickness that had taken hold of him. Maria had tried everything, pleaded with doctors, knocked on doors for work, even sold the few precious possessions she had left. But the world had been unkind, its doors closing one after another. Now, all she had was her voice, a voice that once brought joy to those who listened, a voice that had once been her dream. She took a deep breath and began to sing. Her voice, though fragile at first, floated into the night like a prayer. A song her mother used to sing when times were hard, a song of hope, of love, of better days. She sang not for money, not for attention, but for Matteo, for the chance, however slim, that someone would hear her, someone who could help. Cars rushed by, their headlights flashing across her tired face. Some drivers turned their heads for a moment before speeding away, unwilling to pause in their busy lives. Others didn't notice at all, but Maria kept singing, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's desperation. Then, a car slowed down. Aye. Sleek black Cadillac pulled up to the curb, its engine purring softly in the quiet night. The tinted window rolled down just enough for Maria to see a pair of watchful eyes staring at her. A man sat inside, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. Maria's voice faltered for a moment. Her instinct screamed to be careful, but she had nothing left to lose. So she kept singing, her voice stronger now, pouring every ounce of emotion into the melody. The man inside the Cadillac didn't move. He simply listened. And then, without a word, he reached into his pocket. Maria held her breath. Maria's breath hitched as she watched the man's hand disappear into his pocket. Her grip tightened around Matteo, instinctively shielding him. A mother's fear was always there, always lurking, especially when the world had been as cruel as it had been to her. But she didn't stop singing. She couldn't. Not when it was. The only thing keeping her from breaking. The man inside the Cadillac was still, almost too still. He wasn't like the others who threw hurried glances before driving away. He was listening, really listening. The dim streetlight barely reached inside the car, casting shadows over his face. She couldn't tell if his expression was kind or cold. She only knew that his presence made her heart pound harder. The sound of rustling fabric broke the silence between them. Maria tensed. Was he pulling out money? A phone? Something worse? Her voice trembled for a split second before she steadied herself. She had sung on countless streets before, watched strangers dig into their pockets, some out of generosity, others out of pity. But something about this man was different. His hand emerged, and Maria caught the glint of something small, a folded bill. He stretched his arm slightly out of the window, holding it toward her. Maria hesitated. There was always a price. Nothing ever came without one. Matteo let out a weak cough in her arms, and just like that, her hesitation vanished. She needed this. Even if it was just a few dollars, it could mean food, medicine, a small piece of hope. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against his for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm, steady. Unlike her own, which were trembling from both the cold and exhaustion. She unfolded the bill, her eyes widening. It wasn't just a few dollars. It was 100. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her lips parting to say something, maybe to thank him, maybe to question why, but before she could, the man spoke. "You have a beautiful voice." His tone was calm, unreadable. Maria swallowed. Compliments used to mean something when she sang in small bars, back when her voice was her dream. not her last hope. Now they felt different, like ghosts from a past life. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the wind. The man's eyes lingered on her for a moment, then flickered to Matteo. "He's sick." It wasn't a question. Maria's body stiffened. Strangers didn't care. Strangers didn't ask. But this one did. She nodded hesitantly. "Yes." The man was silent, as if weighing something in his mind. The hum of his car's engine filled the space between them, a low, steady sound that somehow made Maria feel even more exposed. She had learned not to trust easily. Life had taught her that. "Take care of him," the man finally said. Then, without another word, the window rolled up and the Cadillac pulled away, its taillights glowing red before disappearing into the night. Maria stared after it, the bill still clutched in her hand. $100, more than she had seen in weeks. But it wasn't just the money that left her shaken, it was the man himself. His presence, his quiet observation, the way he had stopped for her when no one else had. Who was he? Matteo stirred weakly in her arms, breaking her thoughts. His fever was still high. The money could help, but not for long. She needed more than luck. She needed a real miracle. She stood, holding Matteo close, and made her way toward the small motel where she had been staying. It wasn't much, just a single room with peeling wallpaper and a heater that barely worked, but it was a roof, a temporary escape from the streets. Inside, she laid Matteo down on the bed, brushing damp curls from his forehead. His fevered skin burned against her touch. "Just a little longer, baby," she whispered. "We'll figure this out." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. How? She had no job, no savings, no one to turn to. And now, there was something else pressing on her mind, the man in the Cadillac. Why had he stopped? Why had he given her so much? And why did she have the strangest feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd see him? Maria barely slept that night. The $100 bill sat on the nightstand beside her, a reminder that, for now, she and Matteo had a little more time. But time was slipping away too fast. Matteo's fever hadn't broken, and his small body felt even weaker against her own. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, whispering soft reassurances, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince him or herself. Outside, the city was still alive. Cars passed, distant sirens wailed, and voices drifted through the thin motel walls. Life went on for everyone else. But for Maria, it felt like the world had stopped moving the moment Matteo got sick. As the night dragged on, exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind refused to rest. The man in the Cadillac lingered in her thoughts. There was something unsettling about how he had watched her, the way he had spoken, calm, deliberate. She had been ignored by so many people, yet he had stopped. Why? Morning crept in through the dusty blinds, bringing with it a dull gray light. Maria checked Matteo's forehead, again still burning. Panic clawed at her chest. The $100 could buy food, maybe even some medicine, but it wouldn't be enough for a real doctor. And she knew deep down that he needed more than just over-the-counter pills. She pulled on her worn-out jacket, hesitating only for a moment before slipping the bill into her pocket. She had to try. She couldn't just sit and wait for things to get worse. The streets were already busy when she stepped outside. The cold stung her face as she walked, keeping Matteo close to her chest. She passed familiar alleys, the places where she had sung before, where people had either spared a few coins or ignored her completely. Today she wasn't here to sing. Today she needed answers. She retraced her steps to where the Cadillac had stopped the night before. The city never held still. New cars lined the street, different faces moved past her. But the memory of the man's gaze lingered. He hadn't just been passing through. He had been watching. Maria's pulse quickened. Maybe she was desperate enough to imagine things. Maybe it was nothing. but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something unfinished. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over her, and she tightened her hold on Matteo. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. "Excuse me," a voice said. Maria turned sharply, instinctively stepping back. Woman stood in front of her mid-40s, wrapped in a heavy coat, her expression one of concern. "Are you okay?" Maria forced a nod. "I'm fine." The woman's eyes flickered to Matteo, then back to her. "You were singing here last night, weren't you?" Maria tensed. "Yes, I saw you," the woman said. "And I saw the man in the Cadillac." Maria's stomach twisted. "Do you know him?" The woman hesitated, lowering her voice. "I've seen him before. He doesn't just stop for anyone." Maria swallowed hard. "Who is he?" The woman glanced around before answering. "His name is Daniel Mercer. He's someone people don't ask too many questions about." Maria's heart pounded. That name meant nothing to her. But the way the woman said it, like it carried weight, like it was something she should already know, made her uneasy. "He gave me money," Maria admitted, watching the woman's reaction. The woman pressed her lips together. "Then he noticed you. That could be good or bad." Maria's throat went dry. "Bad how?" The woman shook her head. "Just be careful." Then, before Maria could ask anything else, the woman turned and disappeared into the morning. Crowd, Maria stood frozen, the weight of the $100 bill in her pocket suddenly heavier than before. Daniel Mercer. The name lingered in her mind like an unanswered question. And somehow, she knew this wasn't over. Maria hurried back to the motel, her mind racing. The name Daniel Mercer repeated in her head like an echo she couldn't shake. The woman's warning clung to her, filling her with unease. Who was he? And why did it feel like she had stepped into something far bigger than she understood? Inside the motel room, Matteo stirred weakly, his small body still burning with fever. Maria knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his forehead. He needed real help. The $100 was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the bill, staring at it. Had it been kindness, or something else? And if she saw Daniel Mercer again, would he still be willing to help? A knock at the door sent her heart into her throat. Maria hesitated, fear curling in her stomach. No one knew she was here, no one except. She opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, but it wasn't Daniel. This man was taller, broader, dressed in a dark jacket. His face was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a chill through her. "Maria?" His voice was deep, steady. Her grip tightened on the door. "Who are you?" the man exhaled. "I work for Daniel Mercer. He wants to see you." Maria's pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct told her to slam the door. But then she glanced at Matteo, his frail body struggling against the fever. She didn't have a choice. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. "He wants to help." Help. The word felt too easy, too simple. But Maria knew that nothing in this world came without a price. She turned back to Matteo, brushing his damp curls from his face. If she stayed here, waiting for a miracle, she might lose him. Taking a shaky breath, she nodded. "I'll go." The man stepped aside, waiting. Maria wrapped Matteo in his blanket, holding him close. No matter what happened next, she wouldn't leave him behind. The black car waiting outside wasn't the Cadillac from last night, but it was just as sleek, just as silent. Maria slid into the back seat, her heart pounding as the door shut behind her. As they pulled away from the motel, she watched the city blur past, her stomach twisting. Who was Daniel Mercer? And what had she just stepped into? The car moved smoothly through the city, its engine barely making a sound. Maria held Matteo close, feeling the steady rise and fall of his shallow breaths. The air inside was too still, too quiet, except for the faint hum of the tires against the road. The man driving hadn't said a word since they left the motel, and Maria didn't dare ask questions, not yet. She stared out the window, watching familiar streets fade into unfamiliar ones. The buildings grew taller, the sidewalks less crowded. Wherever they were going, it wasn't anywhere she'd been before. Her grip on Matteo tightened. Finally, the car slowed in front of a tall, dark building. It wasn't flashy, but it had a presence heavy, imposing. The driver stepped out first, walking around to open her door. Maria hesitated. Every warning in her mind screamed at her to run, but she had come this far. And Matteo, he needed help. She stepped out, cradling her son against her chest as the man led her inside. The lobby was quiet, the lights dim. A receptionist barely glanced up before pressing a button behind the desk. Moments later, a set of elevator doors slid open. Maria's legs felt unsteady as they ascended. The air in the elevator was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than it should. When the doors finally opened, she found herself in a dimly lit room lined with tall windows that overlooked the city. And there he was. Daniel Mercer stood near the window, his back to her. The glow of the city lights cast long shadows across the floor. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable, just like the night before. "You came," he said simply. Maria swallowed hard. "You sent someone." "I didn't have much choice." Daniel's gaze dropped to Matteo. His expression flickered just for a second before he nodded toward a nearby couch. "Sit. He looks worse than last night." Maria hesitated, then moved carefully, lowering Matteo onto the couch. She brushed damp hair from his face, her heart pounding. "Why am I here?" she asked, not looking up. Daniel walked toward a small cabinet, pulling out a bottle of water and placing it in front of her. "Because I can help you." Maria's jaw tightened. "People don't help for nothing." Daniel studied her for a moment before he spoke. "You're right." A heavy silence settled between them. Maria's pulse quickened. She had expected him to deny it, to tell her she was wrong. But he didn't. Daniel sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. "I saw you last night for a reason, Maria, and it wasn't just because of your voice." Her breath caught in her throat. "You think I stopped because I felt sorry for you?" he continued. "That's not why." Maria's hands clenched in her lap. "Then why?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes darkening. "Because I've been looking for you." The room felt colder suddenly, the air heavier. Maria's mind spun. "What are you talking about?" "You don't know me." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I know more than you think." Maria shook her head, her heart racing. "No, that doesn't make any sense." Daniel leaned back, watching her carefully. "You think it was a coincidence that I stopped last night? That I was just another stranger passing by?" Maria's throat tightened. "It wasn't." A long pause. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "No, Maria, it wasn't." Maria's breath caught in her throat. The room felt smaller, the air pressing in around her. Matteo let out a soft whimper in his sleep, his fever burning against her skin. But for the first time since she stepped into this building, she barely noticed. All she could focus on was Daniel Mercer's words. "You were looking for me?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her like he was trying to decide how much to say. "Because I owe someone a debt," he finally said. "And that debt leads back to you." Maria shook her head. "That doesn't make any sense. I don't know you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "But you knew my father." A chill ran down Maria's spine. "Your father?" Daniel nodded slowly. His name was Samuel Mercer. Maria's heart stopped. That name. She hadn't heard it in years, but she knew it. She had once trusted it, believed in it. And then she had lost everything. She gripped the edge of the couch, her hands trembling. No, that's not possible. But it was. The past she had buried, the nightmare she had tried to outrun it, had all just crashed back into her life. Samuel Mercer had been the man who promised to help her when she was younger, back when she had nothing but a voice and a dream. He had seen potential in her, had given her a chance until he betrayed her, until he disappeared, leaving her with nothing. And now, sitting in front of her, was his son. Daniel watched her carefully. "I didn't expect you to trust me," he said quietly. "But I need you to know I'm not my father." Maria's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this wasn't just another trap, but she had spent too many years surviving to be fooled so easily. "Then why are you here?" she asked, forcing the words out. Daniel exhaled. "Because he left something behind. Something that belongs to you." Maria's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, worn envelope. He held it out to her. Maria hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar, painfully so. It was from Samuel Mercer. "Maria, if you're reading this, it means my past has caught up with me. I never made things right, and I know I can't undo what I did. But there's something that was always meant to be yours. My son, Daniel, will know what to do. I hope somehow this makes a difference." Her vision blurred as she stared at the words. She didn't know whether to scream or cry. Daniel reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small key. He placed it on the table between them. "This opens a safety deposit box," he said. "Inside there's money, a lot of it. More than enough to get Matteo the care he needs, more than enough to give you the life you were meant to have." Maria's head spun. This had to be a trick, a setup. It was too much, too sudden. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Daniel's expression softened. "Because my father stole your future," he said. "And I want to give it back." Tears burned in Maria's eyes. She looked down at Matteo, his tiny body curled against her. He needed her to be strong. He needed her to trust, just this once. She reached for the key. Maybe, just maybe, this time fate was on her side. Maria stared at the key in her hand, its cold metal pressing into her palm. It felt too small to hold so much weight, yet it carried the promise of a future she never thought possible. Her fingers tightened around it as she looked up at Daniel, searching his face for any sign of deception. But all she saw was quiet determination. Matteo stirred slightly, letting out a weak cough. The sound snapped Maria back to reality. Whatever questions she had, whatever doubts still lingered, none of them mattered more than him. He needed help now. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Where is it?" Daniel stood, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "I'll take you there." Maria hesitated, then slowly got up, cradling Matteo against her chest. The fever had drained him, his little body limp with exhaustion. She pressed a kiss to his forehead before following Daniel out of the room. The ride was silent, but it wasn't tense. Maria could feel something shifting inside her fear, hope, uncertainty, all tangled together. She kept her eyes on Matteo, whispering to him softly, promising that everything was going to be okay, even if she wasn't sure she believed it herself. When they arrived, Maria felt a fresh wave of anxiety. The bank was sleek and modern, nothing like the places she was used to. As they stepped inside, Daniel led her past the polished counters and straight to a private office, where an older man greeted them with a polite nod. "You have the key?" the man asked. Maria hesitated. then slowly placed it on the desk. The man retrieved a box from a secured vault, setting it in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, stacks of cash were neatly packed, but that wasn't what made Maria's breath catch. Resting atop the bills was something she hadn't seen in years, a delicate silver pendant. Her pendant. The one she had lost when everything fell apart. Her chest tightened as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. It was real. It was all real. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so long running, so long surviving, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have something given back to her. Daniel cleared his throat. It's enough to start over. Get Mateo the care he needs. Find a home. A real one. Maria turned to him, struggling to find the words. Why are you doing this? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I've spent my whole life watching my father destroy people. I don't want to be like him. Maria held his gaze, searching for any trace of dishonesty. But there was none. She let out a shaky breath and nodded. They left the bank together, the box held tightly in Maria's arms. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. Over the next few days, Maria did exactly what Daniel said she could. She took Mateo to a doctor, an actual doctor, not a free clinic that could only do so much. They admitted him immediately, giving him the care he had needed for far too long. She stayed by his side, watching as the fever finally broke, as color returned to his cheeks. One night, as she sat beside his hospital bed, her fingers gently combing through his hair, she felt the weight of everything settle over her. The past, the struggles, the unexpected turn of fate that had brought her here. She thought about Daniel, about how easily he could have walked away. But he hadn't. When Mateo finally woke, his small fingers curled around hers. His voice was hoarse but stronger than before. Mama, Maria smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm right here, mi amor. And for the first time in a long time, she truly was. A week later, she stepped out of the hospital with Mateo in her arms, the sun warm on her face. She had a new place to stay, a plan, a future that no longer felt impossible. She didn't know where the road would take her, but she knew one thing: she wasn't afraid anymore. As she walked down the street, the city buzzing around her, she hummed softly, a song just for Mateo. And this time, when a car slowed to listen, she didn't feel fear, she felt free.